Hume Nisbet was born in 1849 in Stirling, Scotland. Moving to Australia at age 16, he returned to London in 1872, spending a year as a minor actor in a Theatre Royal in Australia. Upon his return to Britain, he studied art at the National Gallery and South Kensington Museum, and then worked as a scene painter in Edinburgh, where he met and married his first wife, Helen. He subsequently became an art master of the Watt Institution and School of Arts in Edinburgh, teaching freehand drawing between 1878 and 1885. A prolific writer, he published about 46 novels, as well as submitting articles and sketches to Picturesque Australasia between 1887 and 1889, while also publishing novels critical of the treatment of Aboriginals in Australia. In 1901, his first wife Helen died, and a year later, in 1902, he married 73-year-old dual widow Catherine Septima Armitage at Bristol. Following the death of his second wife, he decided he'd try for a third time, marrying another widow, Blanche Dolby, in 1914. He died in Eastbourne in 1923, survived by 2 of his 6 children. Today, we'll examine 2 works published by Nisbet within a year of each other, his novel Valdmer the Viking and his collection The Haunted Station and Other Stories. Valdmer the Viking, a romance of the 11th century by sea and land, was published in 1893. Essentially, this isn't one story, but 3 different ones that sort of start and stop without much connective tissue. The story starts out in Shetland and Denmark, detailing the fortunes of the family of Valdmer the Viking, the death of his father in battle against the King of Denmark, and the plottings of his witch mother who tries to use her magic to murder her own son since she falsely blames him for her husband's death. Then the plot gets put on hold, and suddenly Valdmer and his brother join the Danish raid on England, and for chapters and chapters, Valdmer does describe the merry slaughter of the local population, and also how he became a Christian during it, only to go right back on to pirating and slaughtering sea merchants for their valuables. After this plot ends with the temporary banishment of Valdmer's brother, and thus of himself, suddenly the Vikings run across a weird race of people from a faraway, technologically advanced land, where they are taken to give fresh blood to the local gene pool. But the island civilization of Tula is reached only 100 pages before the end, and most of the time spent there is devoted to Valdmer seeking to revive the body of his wife from a past life who has been appearing to him as a spirit inside of a mysterious harp that he used during his adventures. During this, all ends up rather abruptly, without much time spent on the Tulan civilization at all, except to say how the men are all wearied by having to take care of up to 12 wives at once, since the volcanic mountains begins to erupt, and most of the Tulan ships that do leave with the Vikings get lost at sea except for one, and everyone who survived ends up stuck on an iceberg for several months anyway, leading to all of the Tulans dying, along with Valdmer's beloved wife, who was constantly showcased and foreshadowed, and whose resurrection was the entire purpose of the whole Tulan episode. Then they return home, find Valdmer's evil mother and good blind sister dead, and at the end I'm just left to wonder, why doesn't Nisbet write so that whatever happens, it will have no consequence? All of the Tulans are dead. Valdmer loses his sweetheart almost as soon as they meet, and even the plot thread of Valdmer's vengeful mother is never taken up again after the first third of the book was so heavily devoted to it, and to a scheming and swearing bloody revenge because she assumed he caused the death of her husband. I feel rather unsatisfied, to be honest. Had Nisbet picked one of the 3 scenarios and stuck with it, it could have been a satisfying book, but as it is, none of these plots get the briefing room they require and end up fizzling out. The Haunted Station and Other Stories followed in 1894. The Haunted Station refers not to a train station, as may seem to a casual reader, but to a quote-unquote station, meaning a colonial dwelling built by settlers in Australia. We see here a man sent to Australia for the murder of his wife, unjustly, who escapes from a prison camp and finds an abandoned house. Here, though it is well provisioned, he is menaced by the spirits of the murderous owner of the house, who was murdered by his own friend and then brought about through this man and possessing his body the death of his wife and daughter. The Odic Touch is a story where a man is continuously rescued from floundering by the timely intervention of a strangely philanthropic beneficiary. An Ocean Dream narrates the inhabitants of a ship getting together in sleep and taking a short jog back to land in spirit. A Queensland Iliad, meanwhile, gives us a story of a shepherd besieged by a group of ornery natives trying to steal his sheep and what became of him. The Demon Spell is a short supernatural story of a dream and a strange amulet that is rather ambiguous. A Face at the Window is a story where a man is possibly haunted by the presence of the previous owner in an abandoned house, kind of similar to the first story in many ways. A house which he took on his own, but the supernatural element is never confirmed either way, and the title refers to something far more benign. The Phantom Model, meanwhile, details an artist's obsession with a horrid woman, vulgar and irresponsible, who takes her time drinking herself slowly to death, and has spent years doing so because she was told she had only 4 months to live. After her death, he becomes obsessed with her, and his own strange longing culminates in her most mysterious and unsettling return. Now, the remaining stories lack any supernatural element, really, beyond the inexplicable dream of the narrator at the beginning of Delphine, which is only incidental, never counted for much in any real way in the story, and a Dickensian and ultimately ignored dream in A Deadly Voyage. These are mostly adventure tales, some shorter and some longer. Marie St. Pierre is slightly confusing. It is a short narration in the first person and past tense. A woman planning suicide because of a faithless lover and apparently accomplishing her aim, but nevertheless narrating somehow. Through the Gap is the story of a rapscallion trader who ends up amongst the natives of Guinea and finds himself a wife, and ends up having to lead the friendly local cannibals of his adopted village in a desperate battle against the invading German colonial army. A Deadly Voyage is a story that begins to sort of is a Dickensian sort of tale. You have John Daggett, a wicked shipowner who buys rotting ships, overstocks them with useless cargo, in the hopes that they will sink, and then cheats both insurance companies and the widows of the sailors of their earned wages. He keeps 2 people, his niece Mary and her lover Richard Harris, in his house after he took over the management of their fortunes and stole them all while pretending that they never had any fortune to begin with. Daggett, in the beginning of the story, takes a nap and has a dream of his drowned sailors and the widows and orphans besieging him and being driven onto one of his own rotting husks, forced to eat salted meat that is 20 years old. And then he wakes up and is still an absolute bastard, who turns out Harris onto the street because Harris refuses to confirm his lie that the wages of his drowned workers had all been drawn in advance. And then it turns quite abruptly into the story of Harris going about begging and eventually being employed aboard a variety of ships until the last ship he's on sinks, and he just sort of happens to be rescued by a captain who knew his father in Australia and who ends up fighting Daggett in court to reclaim both fortunes of Richard Harris and of Mary that Daggett stole. It seems at first like a Christmas story a la Dickens, especially because it begins and the dream that Daggett has happens on Christmas Eve, but it seems Nisbet changed his mind about that mid-writing, and then it turns into an adventure story focusing on Harris, and then this fortune is just sort of returned to him in an epilogue through almost entirely the work of someone else. Now, Delphine is one rather puzzling thing, in the sense that you sit there and read what the narrator obviously telegraphs to you, and you wonder how exactly he can be oblivious of what he's writing down, because the woman he meets on board the cruise ship, being the same woman he saw in his mysterious dream murdering her vicious aunt with her brother, is completely and utterly obvious, and the way he keeps setting down all the clues and all the obvious telegraphed hints without being made aware of it just makes you want to scream at this guy for being so bloody dense. And it's not much of a spoiler since it's increasingly and bewilderingly obvious from step 1, as is the fact the sour-faced couple which dogs the step of the narrator and Delphine, the women murderess, a pair of detectives sent after the murderers to try and have them arrested. Now, Humphrey Bolin's account of the Spanish Armada invasion is a longish tale narrating a span of some months during which a man from Plymouth joined Drake's men to defend England from the Spanish Armada. The story is prefaced with some love-making issues, with the man's beloved being beset upon by her infuriating, foppish cousin, but the story proper is good if not overlong or very detailed. And it is, a serviceable summary of a few skirmishes of that memorable battle, leading to the narrator's capture as a galley slave of the Spaniards before being released to his liberty when the ship founders on the coasts of Ireland. This is one of the more unusual stories in the book because, while not all of them deal with Australia or the Guinea, as a lot of them do, and even then most of them take place around the present time of the publication, whereas this story is more than 200 years in the past. 300 years in the past, and therefore is more unusual and seems to sort of not fit very well, although admittedly the story, in the introduction, Nisbet says how he's wrote the story as a sort of fin de siècle collection, but only some of the early pieces of the book sort of conform to that, whereas the later half of this collection is more of a straightforward collection of adventure stories. Not bad, and overall certainly there was nothing as haphazard or, distracted as Valdmer the Viking, which, while an interesting book, has a problem that, there isn't really much narrative cohesion and it doesn't really seem like a complete book. Here, the stories do sort of work independently, although there are times when you wish they would be longer, like with the last story, because you think there would be a lot more to narrate about the fight against the Spanish Armada. However, Nisbet is still an accomplished writer, and I do look forward to reading more of him in the future.